Part 1. The moment everything changed. The spit hung in the air for what felt like forever. Not falling, not flying, just suspended there in the space between arrogance and consequence, between a boy who had never once been told no and a woman who had heard it every single day of her life. When it landed on Dorothy Calloway's cheek, sliding slowly downward toward the edge of her worn white apron, the Silver Spoon Diner didn't just go quiet. It went silent. The kind of silence that makes your ears ring. The kind that settles into the chest like cold water and stays there. The kind that tells every person in the room that something fundamental has just shifted in the world, something that cannot be unshifted, something that will matter long after this particular morning is over and forgotten by everyone except the people who were standing inside it. And then from the corner booth near the window, a chair scraped against the linoleum floor. Just once, low and deliberate, the sound of a decision being made by someone who had been waiting 47 years to make it. 22 hours earlier, the alarm was set for 5 o'clock, but Dorothy Calloway's eyes opened at 4:53. They always did. Her body had long since stopped waiting for permission. 62 years of living will do that to a person. Teach you that rest is something borrowed that morning, comes whether you are ready or not, that the only thing standing between a sleeping child and an empty refrigerator is the woman willing to get up before the sun does and keep getting up day after day for as long as the child needs her, and then for a while after that too. She lay still for a moment in the gray dark of her bedroom on Sycamore Street. The house was quiet in that particular way small houses get quiet in the hours before dawn. Every creak of the walls settling, every tick of the baseboard heater cycling through its routine. Every soft sound of the world outside beginning its slow negotiation with another day. She knew all of it, had known every sound and every crack and every place where the floor protested under her weight for 38 years. This house that was supposed to be a starting point had become the whole journey, and somewhere in the middle decades she had made her peace with that, mostly. She swung her legs over the side of the bed and her knees said good morning the way they always did now, sharp and unambiguous. The arthritis had been advancing since the previous winter, claiming new territory in her hips, and in the small bones of her right hand, the hand she used to carry plates and pour coffee and write down orders she had already memorized, because writing them gave customers the feeling of being heard, of mattering, which was something Dorothy understood the value of even when the world did not extend it to her. She had mentioned the arthritis to her doctor 14 months ago, back when she still had insurance coverage. He had prescribed something effective. She had filled that prescription twice. The third bottle sat empty on her nightstand because the paperwork on her coverage had lapsed, and she kept meaning to sort it out, and the weeks had a particular talent for disappearing before she could. She moved through the dark by memory, down the hall past the closed door behind which her granddaughter Lucy was still sleeping, 8 years old, second grade. Stubborn as the Montana winter, and twice as bright and possessed of a laugh that could reorganize a room. Dorothy paused at that door the way she always did, listening for the soft sound of a child breathing, the whole reason for everything arranged itself around that sound every single morning. In the kitchen she started the coffee, the inexpensive kind, in the red can, the kind she had been drinking for so long that it had become less a taste than a condition of being awake. While it percolated, she laid out Lucy's clothes for school, checked the backpack, made sure the lunch money was in the small, zippered pocket where Lucy could find it without asking. Small acts performed in the dark with the sureness of repetition. The kind of love that never appears in anyone's idea of a significant life, but is in fact the entire foundation of one. On the mantel in the living room stood 2 photographs. The first was Frank, her husband, Sergeant Frank Calloway, United States Army, photographed in his dress uniform with the particular half-smile he wore whenever a camera was pointed at him, because he could never quite take the occasion of a photograph seriously. He had been gone 14 years. Lung cancer diagnosed in the spring of 2010, moving faster than the doctors had prepared them for. He died in February of 2011, and Dorothy had held his hand in a hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and winter until there was no longer a hand to hold. After he was gone, she had understood for the first time that grief is not an event, but a climate that you do not pass through it, but rather learn to live inside it, to do the daily work of existing within a world that now has a permanent absence, shaped exactly like someone you loved. The second photograph was her son Dylan, high school football uniform, 17 years old maybe in the picture. Bright smile, bright future, all the light of someone who has not yet encountered the specific darkness that was waiting for him. He was 35 now and finishing out a sentence at a facility upstate. Lucy was his daughter. Dorothy was raising her. That was the shape of things, and she did not allow herself to examine it too closely on mornings when she needed to function. She drank her coffee, standing at the kitchen window, watching the sky above the rooftops perform its slow transformation from black through deep blue toward the faint suggestion of gray that preceded actual light. When it was light enough, she went to wake Lucy. Her granddaughter was already half awake, sitting up in bed, with her hair arranged by sleep into something sculptural, blinking at the room with the grave expression of a child who has not yet decided whether morning is acceptable. Is Daddy coming home soon? It came the way it always came. Not demanding, not dramatic. Just sincerely curious. The way children ask about things they have been told will eventually happen, verifying that eventually is still moving in the right direction. Dorothy sat on the edge of the bed and smoothed the hair back from Lucy's forehead. Getting closer every day, baby girl. You just focus on school. Lucy nodded. Lay back down. That was enough for her. She was 8 years old and she trusted her grandmother with the absolute and uncalculating faith of a child who has not yet learned that trust should be rationed, and Dorothy Calloway intended to be worthy of that faith for as long as she was breathing, even when being worthy of it required saying things that were only partially true. Sometimes love looks like a gentle misdirection that gets a child through the morning and into the day, and eventually into the kind of life where the hard things can be understood rather than merely absorbed. The drive to the Silver Spoon Diner took 11 minutes through the waking streets of Millbrook, Montana. Population 4,200. The kind of town where the hardware store and the gas station have been owned by the same families for longer than most of the residents have been alive. Where people wave from their trucks out of accumulated habit. Where the lumber operation on the north side of town is the biggest employer and the biggest dream for the young people is leaving. And the biggest secret is that a meaningful percentage of those who leave eventually come back, because it turns out the world beyond Millbrook is large and expensive and indifferent in ways that the town, for all its limitations, is not. Dorothy had stopped thinking seriously about leaving somewhere in the late 1980s. Now her ambitions fit inside a single room. Lucy's school supplies restocked before they ran out, the orthodontist appointment in April, making it through another Montana winter without the furnace requiring a repair she couldn't currently afford. Getting the car inspected without discovering something she would have to add to the list of things she was managing around. The Silver Spoon Diner sat on the corner of Main and 4th, a single-story building in red brick with a neon sign that had been buzzing in the window since the Reagan administration. Roy Stanton's pickup was already in the lot when she pulled in, which meant the grill was hot and the first coffee was brewed and the day had officially begun. Roy Stanton was 67 years old. He had owned the Silver Spoon for 22 years, having purchased it with money from the GI Bill after retiring from the Marines with the considered opinion that what he wanted most in the world was a place where people could sit down and eat something hot and feel for the length of a cup of coffee and a plate of eggs that someone was glad they came in. He was not a sentimental man in the way that people who announce their sentimentality are sentimental. He was a former Marine, but he had built something that functioned like a second home for the people of Millbrook, and he ran it with the quiet competence of a man who does not need to explain himself because his work explains him. Morning dot. He said it from behind the grill without looking up. Morning, coffee's on. I see that. She was already moving toward the pot. She tied her apron and began her opening routine with the economical precision of someone who has performed the same sequence 10,000 times and discovered that efficiency is not about speed, but about knowing exactly what needs to happen and doing it without the friction of hesitation. Napkin dispensers, salt and pepper shakers checked and refilled, condiment caddy placed correctly at each table, counter wiped down, coffee station restocked, sign flipped from closed to open. Every movement placed exactly where it needed to be. By 7 o'clock, the first regular had come through the door. By 7:15, the rumble started. You hear it before you see it. That is the particular quality of 10 Harley-Davidsons moving together through the quiet streets of a small Montana town in the early morning. The sound arrives ahead of them, like weather low and resonant felt in the sternum before it fully registers in the ears. And if you know what that sound means, if you have been hearing it on Thursday mornings for 2 decades, it does something to the interior of you that is closer to settling than to alarm. Dorothy set down the coffee pot when she heard them coming. She reached for the second tray of cups without thinking about it. They came into the parking lot with the ease of people who have been moving together through more consequential spaces than the corner of Main and 4th for 30 years. 10 motorcycles, chrome catching the early light. The formation broke smoothly as they found their Spaces engines cutting out one at a time until the silence that followed felt large the way silence always feels large after a sound that substantial. the Iron Brotherhood Motorcycle Club. That was what the people of Millbrook called them. What the people of Millbrook did not always understand, what the patch on the back of each leather vest made plain to anyone who knew how to read it, was simpler and more serious than the name suggested. Protect those who serve. 4 words stitched carefully, worn daily. The woman who climbed off the lead motorcycle first was 61 years old, and she moved the way certain people move when they have made a permanent agreement with their own body, deliberately, with the full weight of attention behind each step. Silver had been working its way into her dark hair for the better part of a decade, which she had never tried to stop or conceal, because she had earned it the way you earn things that cost you something real. Her name was Victoria Webb, though almost no one in Millbrook had called her that in 30 years. They called her Hammer, had called her that since the early days of the Brotherhood, when the men she rode with had watched her argue a veterans benefits case in a Helena courtroom with a calm and precision that made the opposing counsel look like he had brought a penknife to a surgery. And Dean Briggs had said afterward, quietly and with complete admiration, "That woman hits like a hammer and nothing moves her," and the name had attached itself and never let go. She was a lawyer, had been for 28 years. She ran a small practice out of an office above the hardware store on 3rd Street, specializing in veterans benefits, disputes disability, claims, the long and grinding paperwork wars that men and women who had served their country were required to fight long after the service itself had ended. She had built the Iron Brotherhood with people like herself, veterans, most of them, or the children of veterans, all of them people who had come to understand through various forms of experience that the civilian world did not always speak their language, and that community was something you built rather than waited to be given. The 9 others who followed her inside had their own histories, their own reasons. Dean Briggs, 59, who ran 3 auto shops across the state and whose hands had rebuilt enough engines that the work had become something closer to instinct than skill. Everett Thorne, 60, the one they called Doc, former Army medic, a man who had seen enough of what bodies cost that the sight of suffering no longer destabilized him, but the waste of it made him steadily furious. Shepard Caulfield, 58, retired Methodist minister who still preached occasionally at the VA hospital, and who still, despite every reasonable argument that experience might have assembled against it, believed in the human capacity for genuine change. And 6 others ranging from 55 to 65 each, carrying their own particular weight of service and return in the ongoing negotiation with a world that asked more than it acknowledged. Table 9. Always Table 9. It had become theirs. Over 20 years of Thursday mornings claimed the way certain spots in certain places become claimed by people who return to them faithfully enough, acquiring a kind of sanctity that has nothing to do with permission. Dorothy appeared with the coffee pot in the second tray before they had fully settled. That same professional warmth she brought to every customer, but layered underneath it, for these particular people, the specific warmth of 2 decades of Thursdays, of being known and remembered and treated with the straightforward dignity that she provided everyone and that not everyone returned. "Right on time, gentlemen." Victoria looked at her when she said it, not the way customers generally look at waitresses, which is to say through them or around them, processing them as functional elements of the environment, rather than as people occupying the same moral space. Victoria looked at her the way she had trained herself to look at people over the course of a life that had taught her that the most important information was usually in what people were working to conceal, rather than what they were choosing to display. What she saw that Thursday morning in Dorothy Calloway's face was something she recognized from a very specific context, a very specific year. The eyes doing the job they were required to do, warm and present and professionally engaged, while somewhere behind them something else was happening, something heavier, something that had been happening for a long time and was getting harder to carry. She looked at Doc across the table. Doc had already seen it. He gave her the smallest nod. They were paying attention. This is what Victoria Webb had carried for 47 years. The winter of 1978. She was 14 years old. His mother, Margaret, worked as a waitress at a diner in Billings. Not the kind of diner that got written up in the newspaper. The kind with sticky laminated menus, and a parking lot that flooded every spring, and a cook whose relationship with punctuality was more philosophical than practical. Margaret Webb worked double shifts whenever they were available, which was often because Victoria's father had been gone since Victoria was 9 and there was no one else, which meant that Margaret was not just the person who kept the lights on, but the person who kept everything on the entire architecture of a small life maintained by one woman's daily decision to continue. She was a good mother. She was also, by the time Victoria was old enough to understand the full picture, a tired one. Not the kind of tired that a weekend can address, The kind that comes from being the single load-bearing wall of a structure that was designed for more support, the kind that accumulates in the body at the cellular level and eventually becomes indistinguishable from the body itself. There had been a customer, a man in an expensive suit who had developed the habit of treating service workers as though their labor had somehow transferred their humanity, along with their time, as though being paid to serve someone released that someone from the ordinary obligations of decency. He had made Margaret's life at that diner progressively smaller over a period of months, had crossed eventually a line that made smaller feel like an insufficient word. Margaret had reported it, had gone through the formal mechanisms that existed precisely for this situation, and had discovered, in the way that certain people discover certain things, that formal mechanisms and actual protection are not the same thing. There had been a hearing. There had been a young lawyer. His name was Gerald Langford, 22 years old, newly minted, hungry and skilled, and entirely willing to deploy those skills in whatever direction the case required. He had represented the man in the expensive suit. He had put Margaret Webb on a stand and taken her apart with the methodical efficiency of someone who understood that doubt once introduced into a room is very difficult to remove. He had questioned her consistency, her motivations. He had asked questions whose purpose was not truth, but the manufacture of uncertainty, and he had manufactured it with precision. The case was dismissed. 2 weeks later, Margaret Webb was gone. Victoria had been 14 years old. She had been at school when it happened, which was where her mother had specifically wanted her to be, because Margaret Webb believed in education with the particular intensity of someone who understood that it was the only door she could see clearly, and she was going to make sure her daughter walked through it regardless of what it cost. Victoria had come home to a silence that was different from ordinary silence, a silence with weight and direction, and she had understood before she found her that something had ended. She never spoke about what came after, except in the most compressed terms, and only when compression served a purpose. What she spoke about, what she had organized her entire adult life around, was the clarity that had settled into her in the months following, arriving not as inspiration, but as something more like geological fact, cold and permanent and load-bearing. Nobody should have to stand alone the way her mother had stood alone. She had written the Brotherhood's code herself, on a yellow legal pad on the night before the first meeting 30 years ago. She had written it in longhand, which she always did with things that mattered, because the hand that shapes letters carries something the keyboard does not. Protect those who serve. This is why they came to the Silver Spoon every Thursday. Not only for the coffee, which was decent, or the eggs, which were reliably good, but because Dorothy Calloway was exactly the kind of person the Brotherhood had been built to stand beside. A woman who showed up every morning and worked with dignity and treated every human being who came through that door as though they deserved to be there, and who did this not because it was easy or because it was rewarded, but because it was right, and because Dorothy Calloway had decided at some point that doing right was not something she would make contingent on the behavior of the world around her. Victoria watched Dorothy pour coffee. She watched the slight tremor in her right hand, the wince brief and controlled when she bent to place Doc's cup. She filed it away. Something was coming. She had learned to read the particular quality of air that precedes events the way sailors learn to read water. Not what it would be, just that it was coming. She drank her coffee. She waited. The Mercedes came into the parking lot at 7:43. Victoria saw it through the window before the door opened. Black and expensive in the particular way of things that have never needed to justify their cost. It entered the lot moving faster than necessary and stopped at an angle that occupied two spaces without apparent awareness that the lines between them had any claim on its behavior. The door opened. Harrison Langford was 19 years old. He was tall and athletic in the way of a young man whose physical development had been managed by professionals as an asset rather than discovered through effort, whose fitness was the product of scheduled training and optimal nutrition rather than anything he had chosen. His clothes were expensive, in the way that good things are expensive, quietly and completely made of better materials by better hands, and worn with the absolute indifference of someone who has never once felt the gap between what something costs and what he has. His phone was in his hand before he was fully out of the vehicle. His attention was entirely on the screen as he pushed through the front door of the Silver Spoon Diner. He did not acknowledge the other customers. He did not say good morning. He did not notice the 10 people at the corner booth who watched him cross the floor and settle into the window seat nearest the door, his thumb moving across his phone with the practiced fluency of someone who has learned to exist everywhere except where he physically is. Dorothy appeared with a menu and her professional warmth. Morning, honey, coffee to start. Harrison looked up from his phone, just long enough to process the question. Is it actually good coffee or just the burnt diner kind? The words were not cruel in the obvious sense. They were something that required more skill than cruelty, something calibrated, shaped by years of practice in a particular kind of interaction, the kind that establishes hierarchy without raising a voice, that reminds the person on the receiving end exactly where they stand in the order of things without ever saying it directly. Dorothy's smile held. It had to hold. The electric bill was due. The prescription needed refilling. Lucy's shoes were getting tight. Fresh pot. Made it 20 minutes ago. He waved his hand. The gesture of a man redirecting something he finds mildly inconvenient. Whatever. Black. Give me a few minutes. At table 9, Dean Briggs placed his fork down with a care that had nothing to do with the table's surface. Shepard Caulfield closed his eyes briefly. His lips moved. Doc watched Dorothy's face with the attention of someone who has spent decades reading bodies for information about what they are experiencing and concealing. Victoria watched Harrison. She had her coffee cup in both hands, and she was watching the young man at the window table with the complete stillness of someone who has trained themselves out of reactive motion. Because reactive motion is the enemy of clear seeing, and clear seeing was what this moment required. Dorothy returned 8 minutes later with coffee. She poured it with care. Harrison lifted the cup, tasted it, and let his expression communicate what he was apparently unwilling to articulate directly, and then articulated directly anyway. How long has this actually been sitting? Just made it, like I said. Can I take your order? Forget it. Just bring me egg whites. Folded, not scrambled. Whole wheat toast dry, actually toasted. Fresh fruit on a separate plate. Nothing touching anything else. Can you handle that? The question at the end was not about the order. The question at the end was asking whether competence was something she possessed or merely aspired to, placed with precision in the gap between professional request and personal diminishment, where it would do the most damage without technically crossing any line. Dorothy wrote it down. Her hand did not shake. She would not allow her hand to shake. I'll get that right out. She walked back to the kitchen. Roy looked at her. He had heard everything. The diner had heard everything. You want me to handle it? No. I've got it. She had been saying that for 31 years. She had always had it, always found a way to continue carrying whatever was placed on the load. That was what she did. That was who she was. In the corner booth, Victoria Webb had gone very still. The kind of stillness that is not absence, but the opposite of absence. The kind that happens when something lands in the chest with enough weight that the body requires a moment to organize itself around the new reality of carrying it. She was looking at the young man at the window table. She was looking at him, and she was hearing from somewhere, 47 years in the past, the specific quality of contempt that is most damaging, not because it shouts, but because it doesn't need to. The contempt that is built into a register, a tone, a question mark, placed exactly where it will find the soft place. She was 14 years old, and she was not in the diner in Billings where her mother was working. She was at school doing what her mother had told her to do, keeping her grades up, being where she was supposed to be, trusting that the world her mother was navigating would hold. The world had not held. Doc's hand moved beneath the table, a small gesture in her direction. Easy. Victoria breathed. She picked up her coffee cup. She waited. Dorothy brought the order out 12 minutes later. Egg whites folded with precision. Whole wheat toast at exactly the color that means toasted rather than merely warmed. Fresh strawberries and cantaloupe on a separate plate, arranged so that nothing touched anything else. Every specification honored. 31 years of getting things right, even when getting them right required more effort than anyone who had never done this work would ever understand or acknowledge. Harrison looked at the plate the way someone looks at evidence of a failure they had been expecting to confirm. He poked the eggs with his fork. These are scrambled. Sir, they are folded same as I said, folded like an omelet, not scrambled with extra steps. He held up the toast between two fingers. And this, I said, toasted. Do you know what toasted means? Do you understand the difference? His voice had risen by precisely the amount required to ensure that the tables nearest them could hear while remaining technically within the range of an ordinary conversation. The couple at the adjacent table looked over, registered what they were seeing, looked away with the speed of people calculating that involvement costs more than they are prepared to spend. I'm sorry for the confusion. Let me take that back. And so, Harrison set down his phone, which was the first time he had set it down since entering. He opened a notes application with the efficiency of someone accustomed to creating documentation. Let me be very clear about this, since apparently it's complicated. He dictated the order. Every element, every specification, in the tone of someone reading a legal requirement to someone who has failed to meet it. And then is that something you're capable of managing, or should I ask someone else? Dorothy took the plate. Her hands were steady. Her voice was smaller. I'll take care of it. In the kitchen, Roy was already clearing the grill. She remade the order herself, her right hand trembling twice in the process, breathing through it, with the practice of someone who has learned that certain physical responses cannot be prevented, but can be contained, can be kept from crossing the line from interior experience to exterior expression. She was 62 years old. She had buried a husband and was raising a granddaughter, and she was standing in the kitchen of a diner on a Thursday morning, remaking a breakfast for a boy young enough to be her grandson. And she did not quit because quitting had never been available to her, had never been on the table, was not a door she had ever been able to locate in the room. She carried the second plate out. She set it down. She stepped back. Harrison cut into the eggs without looking at her. Then he looked. The performance of revulsion was immediate and total. Are you kidding me with this? Not a question, a declaration of direction, the voice of someone who has decided where this is going and is now moving toward it with purpose. This is the exact same thing you brought me before. Sir, I promise we remade it completely. He stood up, all 6 feet of 19-year-old privilege rising to its full height, leaning forward slightly, using every inch of the physical advantage to make the geometry of the situation do the work that the words were also doing. He picked up the plate, slammed it back onto the table. The sound went through the diner like something breaking, which was what it was. Eggs scattered, fruit rolled. The sound was still moving through the air when he began again, and his voice had dropped, which was worse than shouting, because soft contempt has a longer range. People like you think that showing up and doing the minimum is worth something. He said it slowly, each word placed. This is why you work in a place like this. This is why you will always work in a place like this. Because you are not good enough for anything better. You have never been good enough for anything better, and everyone in this room knows it. Dorothy stood there. For a single unguarded moment, the 31-year armor developed a crack. Not in her resolve, not in her dignity, in something underneath both of those things. The small interior mechanism that makes it possible to believe that tomorrow might be different from today. The thing that gets you from the alarm at 5 in the morning through the end of the shift and back home to the child who needs you and back to the alarm again. That thing, that necessary thing. He saw it. He went for it. You know what quieter now? Surgical. I don't think you're worth the effort. And he did it. He looked at Dorothy Calloway, 62 years old, 31 years of work performed with dignity in this building, woman who had carried her family across distances that do not appear on any map, and he made her into a target. The spit landed on her cheek. The Silver Spoon diner went silent. Not quiet. Silent. The difference between those two conditions is a canyon. Every conversation, every clinking utensil. Roy Stanton, stepping out of the kitchen, stopped mid-step. The couple at the adjacent table had their hands pressed over their mouths. Nobody moved. Dorothy stood there. The spit slid slowly down her cheek. Her hand came up, automatically reaching for the apron. It stopped halfway. Because even now, even inside this, she was doing the only calculation available to her. She was thinking about the electric bill, about Lucy's shoes, about the prescription she couldn't currently afford, and the 4 years remaining on Dylan's sentence, and the fact that she needed this job, needed it, the way you need load-bearing walls, needed it, in ways that left no room for the luxury of responding to a 19-year-old boy, the way every cell in her body was telling her to respond. She stood there, and from the corner booth near the window, a chair scraped against the linoleum floor. Just once, low and deliberate. Victoria Webb stood up, 61 years old, silver in her hair, eyes that had traveled the distance from a 14-year-old girl doing homework at a kitchen table to this particular moment in this particular diner, and every mile of that distance had been organized around exactly this. Every Thursday morning, every veterans case argued in every courtroom across this state, every word of a code written on a yellow legal pad on the night before everything began. Protect those who serve. She walked across that floor with the calm of a woman who has made a decision from which nothing will unmake her. Her boots made measured sounds against the linoleum, not rushing, not performing, simply moving with the inevitability of something that has been heading toward this point for a very long time. She stopped beside the window table. She looked at Harrison Langford, and then the front door of the Silver Spoon diner opened. Senator Gerald Langford stepped inside, 69 years old. An expensive suit worn with the ease of a man who has been wearing expensive suits in important rooms for so long that the suit has become a kind of skin. The political smile that had been deployed in enough rooms that had operated independently of intention arriving on his face before he had consciously decided to smile. He had come to collect his son. He had not been informed of what he was walking into. The smile stopped. His eyes crossed the room. They found Victoria Webb. And Victoria Webb's eyes found his. The room held its breath. Two people. 47 years of unspoken history compressing itself into the space between them. Gerald Langford had been 22 years old and newly qualified and hungry for success in the winter of 1978. He had taken a case. He had done his job with the ruthlessness that his ambition required. He had stood in a courtroom and dismantled the credibility of a woman named Margaret Webb with the careful precision of someone who understood exactly what he was doing and had calculated that the cost of doing it would be paid by someone other than himself. He had been correct in that calculation. The cost had been paid in full by the woman on the stand and by the 14-year-old girl who had come home from school to silence. He had gone on to become a state assemblyman. Then a senator had built a career on the language of service and accountability, while understanding that both words were instruments rather than obligations. He had not thought about Margaret Webb in years. He was thinking about her now, because the woman standing in the middle of the Silver Spoon Diner, the woman who had just risen from table 9 with the kind of stillness that precedes consequential action, had her mother's eyes. The same directness, the same quality of attention that does not look at you so much as into you past the surface of the presentation and into the calculation underneath. He recognized her. Victoria could see the recognition happen, could see the political machinery engage simultaneously assessing, calculating, running the numbers on what this moment cost and what mitigating it would require. She said nothing. She didn't need to. She held his gaze for exactly the length of time required to communicate that she remembered everything, and that remembering everything was something she had been doing for 47 years. Then she turned back to the boy. She pulled out the chair across from Harrison and sat down. Unhurried, the way you sit when you have decided to be somewhere for a while. In a voice low enough that only Harrison could fully hear it level and completely, without anger, the voice of someone who has already decided and is now simply providing the terms. Victoria Webb said, "You are going to apologize to that woman." Harrison Langford looked up from the table. He looked at the leather vest, the patches, the silver in her hair, the eyes that had seen things he had no framework for imagining. He looked for the first time in 19 years of life at someone he did not immediately know how to manage. Behind Victoria, the sound of 9 chairs moving in near unison. Not aggressive, not theatrical. Just the sound of 9 people choosing to stand up at the same moment, which is a very different sound from one person standing up, a sound with mass and weight and a particular quality of intention. Harrison's eyes moved from Victoria to the wall of leather behind her and back to Victoria. For the first time in 19 years of life, he did not know what came next. Part 2. 60 Days of Truth. The borrowed shoes didn't fit. That was the first thing Harrison registered when he came through the back door of the Silver Spoon Diner at 5:45 in the morning, 3 days after the worst decision of his 19 years. The non-slip shoes Roy Stanton had left for him were a size too large, and with every step across the kitchen floor, they shifted in a way that was constant and small and impossible to ignore. A steady reminder that he was standing in a space shaped by someone else's decades, occupying a position that had been earned by someone else in ways he had not yet begun to understand. Outside, the sky was completely dark. He had never been awake at this hour for something that mattered. Never voluntarily and never for any purpose that required him to be here, rather than somewhere more comfortable. His entire life had been organized around the principle that discomfort was optional, a condition that applied to other people, people whose circumstances had not been properly managed. His circumstances were being managed differently now. Roy was behind the grill, the flat iron already hot, the kitchen carrying the smell of coffee and heated metal and the layered history of 10,000 previous breakfasts. He looked at Harrison with the unhurried assessment of a man deciding what to do with something he hasn't fully classified yet. "Coffee's over there. You're going to need it." Harrison poured a cup, drank it standing. It was terrible. It tasted like the residue of something that had been sitting too long, which it had. He drank it anyway because the alternative was nothing, and his body was making demands that required some response. Roy spoke without looking up from the grill. "Dot gets here at 6. You listen to everything she tells you. You do exactly what she asks. You have questions, you ask her. You have attitude, you swallow it down so far, you forget it was there. We clear, yes, sir." Roy looked at him then. Whatever the look concluded, it stayed with Roy. "Good. Harrison stood in the middle of the kitchen in his wrong shoes, holding his terrible coffee, and tried to recall the last time he had not known what was about to happen. He could not find a single instance. His entire life had been prearranged, the outcomes, if not guaranteed, then at least heavily managed by a father who had understood from early on that control was most effective when it presented itself as opportunity. He heard a car in the lot, an engine working harder than it should, the labored sound of a vehicle held together by maintenance, continually deferred because other expenses were more urgent. Dorothy Calloway came through the back door at exactly 6 o'clock. She saw him. He saw her. There is no existing script for what you say to someone whose face you degraded in front of everyone they have worked alongside for 3 decades. The silence lasted only a moment, but contained a great deal. Dorothy set down her bag and tied her apron. Morning. You're here to learn, so let's get started. No warmth, no coldness. The voice of a professional doing the job she had been given, which was the most complicated possible response to the situation, though Harrison did not understand that yet. Victoria arrived at 7:15 with the Brotherhood. She settled at table 9 and she watched. She had decided in the days between the incident and this morning that her role in the first period was observation, rather than intervention. Not because she was indifferent to what happened, but because she had lived long enough to understand that certain kinds of change can only be assessed, not produced, that the question of whether transformation is genuine or performed requires time and ordinary conditions to answer. You cannot tell from the performance. You can only tell from the accumulation of unguarded moments. Dorothy moved Harrison through the opening routine with the economical patience of someone who has explained procedures thousands of times and made a private decision to explain them as though for the first time, because that is what the work requires regardless of personal feeling. Napkin dispensers, condiment placement. She stopped at table 4 and told him why the ketchup bottle faced a particular direction. Harrison said, "Why does that matter?" Not hostile, genuinely confused. The confusion of someone encountering a logic they had no previous reason to know existed. Dorothy looked at him steadily. Mrs. Delacroix sits at table 4 every Tuesday and Thursday. She has severe arthritis in her right hand. If the bottle faces that way, she can pick it up herself without having to ask for help. She hasn't asked for help in 11 years. I'm not going to be the reason she has to start. Harrison was quiet. Something in his face shifted. A small internal reorganization barely visible from the outside, the kind that happens when a person encounters a system of consideration they had previously assumed did not exist. Victoria from across the room noted it, filed it. The morning rush arrived, and Harrison was immediately and comprehensively terrible at it. He forgot to bring water to table 7 after saying he would. He wrote down a modification wrong and returned to the kitchen with a plate that Roy took back without comment, cracking 2 new eggs and beginning again. And Harrison stood in the kitchen doorway, feeling the specific weight of wasting another person's effort, which is different from wasting your own in ways that are difficult to articulate but impossible to miss. He poured coffee too full, and it sloshed into the saucer. He got a fruit substitution wrong. He confused 2 orders at adjacent tables and had to apologize to both. At table 9, Shepard watched with the patient attention of a man who has witnessed many people attempt difficult things for the first time and has learned not to confuse struggle with failure. Dean watched with the practical eye of someone who assesses what can be built from available materials. Doc watched Dorothy's face more than Harrison's movements, tracking the information that faces carry when they are doing the work of concealing something. Victoria watched and said nothing. At 10 o'clock during the first lull in the morning, Dorothy appeared beside Harrison at the coffee station. "You're doing fine," she said. "I'm doing terribly. Everyone is terrible on the first day. Wait, how long before you weren't?" She looked at him with something small and sought at its foundation. 31 years. Still learning. She moved away. Harrison stood at the station, holding his order pad, and Victoria heard it from across the room and set down her cup and looked out the window at the street and thought about her mother working double shifts in a diner in Billings because the margin between keeping the lights on and losing everything was too narrow to allow for anything other than relentless forward motion. 31 years. Still learning. She thought about what that meant to say out loud, what it required to be the person who could say it. She turned back to her coffee. The second week brought a different quality of difficulty, harder in different ways, and Harrison was beginning to understand that hard work as he had previously understood it, the difficulty of practices with coaches and structured recovery, and someone telling you the reward is coming, was a very different thing from the hard work that had no scheduled relief and no external validation, and simply continued until it stopped, which was when the day ended and then started again. His feet ached in the borrowed shoes. His back had developed a low, persistent complaint that began in the first afternoon hours and built through the rest of the shift. The work was not complex, but it was continuous, and continuous turned out to be harder than complex in ways he had not anticipated. But he was getting incrementally better. The Brotherhood observed this without commenting on it directly, which was its own form of commentary. The quality of their attention changed from something evaluative to something more like ordinary presence, the way the presence of familiar people in a familiar place eventually becomes part of the atmosphere of the place rather than a condition being monitored. Dean Briggs had been working on the diner's ice machine in the back storage room on a Wednesday afternoon when Roy sent Harrison to see if he needed anything. Harrison appeared in the doorway of the small room, and Dean looked up from the machine's exposed interior and said simply, "Come in. You know what's wrong with it?" "No, sir." "Belt's worn through." Dean pointed to a component the size of his thumb. "Whole machine stops making ice because of that one part. Got a replacement in my truck. 15 minutes and it runs again." He handed Harrison the worn belt. Most things that look complicated are just one small part that needs attention. You fix the small thing, the big thing works. He kept his eyes on the machine as he spoke. Life runs the same way. Ignore the small things long enough, one day the whole operation seizes and you're standing in a storage room trying to figure out when it went wrong. Harrison turned the worn belt over in his hands. He put it in his apron pocket. He carried it for the rest of the day and found it 3 days later doing laundry and set it on his desk and sat looking at it for a while. Everett Thorndock operated differently. He was not a man who constructed lessons. He was a man who shared relevant information when information was relevant and trusted the recipient to do something with it. When a young line cook slipped on the kitchen floor and came up limping. One Thursday morning, Doc was off his chair and through the kitchen door before the boy had finished saying he was fine, and Harrison watched from the doorway as Doc worked through the assessment in the wrapping with the practiced calm of someone for whom emergency is a familiar register, rather than an exceptional one. Afterward, washing his hands at the sink, Doc said, without turning around, "Panic does more damage than the injury does most of the time. You want to help someone, the first thing you control is your own reaction. They're already scared. They don't need yours on top of theirs." Shepard Caulfield took a different approach altogether. He was a man who had spent decades thinking about the territory between words and actual transformation, between the stated intention and the genuine reordering of a life, and he had developed a finely calibrated sense of when someone was ready to hear a particular thing and when they were not. He found Harrison scrubbing tables during the slow part of a Wednesday afternoon and sat down in the booth across from the one Harrison was working on. "Do you know what repentance actually is?" Harrison kept scrubbing. "Saying you're sorry?" Shepard shook his head. "An apology is a statement. Repentance is a change of direction, not the feeling of remorse which comes and goes and cannot be controlled. The actual turn, the moment when you stop moving toward one thing and begin moving toward something else entirely. And then you keep moving in that direction even when it's hard, even when no one is watching, even when the feeling has long since faded and all you have is the choice. How do you know when you've gone far enough?" Shepard stood straightening his vest. "You don't. You just keep going, keep becoming something different from what you were. There's no arrival, just the direction you're heading and the consistency with which you head there." Victoria observed these exchanges from the various positions and distances that Table 9 afforded her during the course of a Thursday morning. She did not participate in them directly. This was deliberate, because the instruction needed to feel like it was arising organically from the environment, from multiple sources, from genuine relationships developing in real time, rather than being administered from a single authority. And because Victoria was not certain yet what she herself had to say to Harrison Langford, or whether it was time to say it, she was also conducting a more private examination. She had seen in 30 years of this work every variety of young person attempting the performance of change. She had learned to distinguish the performance from the thing itself, though the distinction was not always visible immediately. It required what she thought of as the unguarded moment, the moment when no one is demonstrably watching, when the behavior of the person reveals itself because the person has forgotten to manage it. She was waiting for those moments in Harrison Langford. She found one on a Thursday in the third week. He did not know she could see him from the angle she was sitting, which was why it counted. A table of 4 teenagers came in mid-morning, the kind that arrive loudly and occupy space with the aggressive ease of people who do not yet know that the world does not belong to them specifically. They ordered complicated modifications and then changed the modifications after the food arrived, and one of them made a comment about the toast that was in the register of Harrison's own first words in this diner. Victoria watched Harrison at the counter watching this table. She saw the recognition cross his face, saw him understand what he was looking at in a way that required no external explanation, saw something that was not comfortable follow the recognition. And then she watched him walk to that table and handle the modified order and the comment about the toast with a patience that was not performed, that was too quiet and too consistent to be performed. That was the patience of someone doing the work because they have decided the work matters rather than because someone is watching. He brought the corrected plates. He said, "I'm sorry about the wait." He did not say it the way you say it when you are going through the motions of service. He said it the way you say something when you mean it specifically and not generally. Victoria turned back to her coffee. She thought maybe, and the thought was more than she had been willing to extend to him 3 weeks earlier. The third Tuesday of Harrison's 60 days arrived with clear, cold weather and the particular quality of morning light that comes in the autumn in Montana, low and angled, and making everything it touches look more deliberate than usual. Victoria had come in alone mid-morning. The others had their own businesses and obligations that organized themselves around the Thursday ritual, but did not consume the rest of their weeks. She sat at table 9 with a cup of coffee and a veterans benefits case. She was working a disability rating dispute for a man in Billings who had been miscalculated 3 times in 6 years by the same system that was theoretically designed to support him. She heard the door. The man who walked in was in his early 60s. He moved with the careful stiffness of a body that has been pushed hard across many years and is now presenting the accumulated invoice. He wore a veteran's cap with a Gulf War unit patch. His face had the quality of someone who has made a decision and is carrying it carefully, both hands trying to keep it level for the duration. He stood in the entrance and looked around the diner. His eyes found Harrison behind the counter. Harrison had not looked up yet. He was writing down an order for the couple at table 3 present in a way that he had not been 3 weeks earlier actually in the room, rather than physically occupying it while his attention lived elsewhere. Dorothy appeared from the kitchen and moved toward the new customer by reflex. The man held up one hand, not unkindly, definitively. "I want the boy." Dorothy read something in his face and stepped back. Harrison looked up. He crossed the diner with his order pad. He stopped at a distance that allowed him to see the man's face clearly. Victoria watched what happened in Harrison's body when he saw that face. Before his expression had time to organize itself into something controlled, before he could decide what to show, his shoulders moved. His jaw shifted. Something drained from behind his eyes. The man said, "You knew my son, Tyler Keene." Victoria did not know the name. She watched Harrison with the attention of someone watching for information rather than reaction. Walter Keene was 62 years old, and he had driven 4 hours to be in this diner. He had not made the drive in anger, or he had moved through the anger into the territory beyond it, which is sometimes the harder place to inhabit, because anger provides direction, and what lies beyond it does not. He had made the drive because his son had believed in something Walter wasn't sure he believed in, and he had decided to try to believe in it on Tyler's behalf. Tyler Keene had been a sophomore at Harrison's school. He had been 15 years old, and he had wanted the way 15-year-olds want things with their entire bodies to belong to the social world that Harrison occupied. The world had not wanted him back. Harrison and his group had made that unwanted, systematic, and daily had constructed an environment in which Tyler Keene was reminded through 100 small mechanisms that he did not belong and could not belong, and that the people around him had agreed on this. Tyler had transferred. 18 months later, Tyler was gone. Walter sat down. Coffee, black, pancakes, bacon. He stated it precisely. "And you're going to bring it to me with a smile. Because that's what Dot does. That's what people in this work do every single day. They smile even when they want to do something else entirely. They do it because the person across from them deserves to be served with dignity regardless of what that person may or may not deserve." His eyes did not move from Harrison's face. "Yes, sir." Harrison walked to the kitchen. Victoria waited. He was gone 11 minutes. Roy appeared at minute 4 with the coffee, which meant Harrison had given the order and then stayed in the back. Victoria considered going back there. She decided against it. Some things needed to happen in private, and what was happening in the kitchen was one of them. When Harrison came out, he carried the plates himself, set them down in front of Walter with care, stood at the table with his hands at his sides. Walter did not look at the food. "Do you remember him?" "Yes, sir." "Do you remember what you did?" Harrison's throat moved. "Yes, sir." Walter cut into his pancakes and ate one deliberate bite. "My son had depression. That's what the doctors determined afterward. Chemical imbalance. Might have happened regardless of anything external." His voice stayed level with an effort that Victoria could see from across the room. "But you didn't help. you and your friends. You spent 8 months telling him he didn't have the right to be where he was standing. Harrison could not speak. Victoria could see that plainly. Walter set his fork down. He looked at Harrison and something in his face shifted, moved through the grief into something more complicated. Something that required more of him than grief did. My son was kind, even to people who were not kind to him. Even toward the end, he believed people were capable of more than they showed. I'm not sure I believe that, he paused, but he would have wanted me to give you the chance. So here I am, don't waste it. Harrison walked away from the table. He made it to the back hallway before he stopped. Victoria put down her cup. She gave it 2 minutes. Then she rose from table 9 and walked through the diner and through the kitchen and found him in the hallway with his back against the wall in the particular state that exists on the far side of tears, the quiet, devastated country past the reach of ordinary emotional response. She stood beside him, not across from him, which would have made it a confrontation. Beside him, which made it something else. He came a long way to give you that, she said. That cost him more than you can measure. I know. Silence. Victoria looked at the wall in front of them. She thought about a 14-year-old girl doing homework at a kitchen table because her mother had told her that keeping her grades up was the most important thing she could do. She thought about believing that trusting that the world her mother was navigating would hold long enough for the grades to matter. She walked back to table 9. She sat down. She picked up her coffee, and it was cold, and she drank it anyway. Dorothy found Harrison in the kitchen 10 minutes later. She looked at him with the attention of someone who has spent decades reading the faces of people navigating things they have not previously encountered, who has learned the particular vocabulary of what a person looks like when they are reorganizing themselves around something that has changed everything. You okay? No, she waited. The kitchen held its ordinary sounds, the refrigeration unit, the tick of the cooling grill. I don't know if anything I do now actually matters. If I'm part of why someone is dead, does it matter what I do after that? Dorothy looked at the stacked supply containers on the industrial shelving opposite. She was quiet for a moment, the quiet of someone thinking rather than preparing. I don't have those answers, she said. Nobody does really, but I know you can't change what's behind you. The only part that still has any give in it is what you do next. She moved past him and back to work. Harrison stood in his kitchen for another minute. Then he tied his apron and went back out to the floor. Week 3 established a rhythm, not comfortable exactly. The work was still physically demanding in ways his body was not yet fully adapted to, and the hours were still longer than anything in his previous life had prepared him for. But the difficulty had become the shape of the day rather than an obstacle encountered within it, which is a distinction that sounds small and is not. Dorothy began calling him Press. He did not notice when it started. He noticed one morning with something approaching surprise that she had been using it consistently for several days, that it had stopped being a shortening of his name and had become something else, something that felt earned rather than assigned a name that was his in this context because he was becoming the person it suited rather than having been born into it. Roy cracked a joke one afternoon and Harrison laughed, and Roy looked momentarily startled, as though he had not fully modeled this outcome, and then he nodded, which was warmth in Roy Stanton's particular register. On the Thursday of the 3rd week, when Victoria came in with the Brotherhood and found Harrison already behind the counter and moving with a competence that had not been there at the beginning, she looked at him from the doorway for a moment before going to table 9. When he brought the coffee, she nodded. Once. Small. The nod of a woman acknowledging something real. Harrison's hands carrying the tray were steady. It was a Tuesday 4 weeks into the 60 days at 10:47 in the morning. 2 men in dark suits came through the front door of the Silver Spoon. Victoria recognized the posture before she saw the badges, the particular efficiency of movement, the scan of the room before either of them spoke. She set her cup down. The taller man spoke to Roy, who had stepped out of the kitchen. FBI. We've received a complaint regarding the Iron Brotherhood Motorcycle Club. We need access to your security footage going back 90 days. Roy's face did not change. What kind of complaint? Coercion? Extortion? Criminal intimidation? Roy said they come in Thursdays. Then we'll be back Thursday. He produced a card. In the meantime, the footage. They took the footage. They left cards. They walked out with the calm of people who have the law moving behind them, like a current, not effortful, simply present and directional. The diner sat in silence. Dorothy had not moved from behind the counter. Her face was doing the work of staying composed, which was visible to anyone who knew what composed effort looked like on her face, which Victoria did after 20 years of Thursdays. She looked at Dorothy. She looked at Harrison. Harrison had gone pale in the specific way of someone who has just watched something arrive that they recognized. Victoria read it, filed it, said nothing. But she read it. She called Harrison at 11:30 that night. Unknown number, but he picked up on the second ring, which meant he had been expecting. Contact had been sitting somewhere in the dark of his childhood bedroom, waiting for it. It's Victoria. We need to talk. The diner. 20 minutes. Come alone. She arrived first. She had a key. She made 2 cups of coffee from the equipment that Dorothy always prepped the night before because preparation was how Dorothy expressed care, and she expressed it daily and completely. Victoria sat at table 9 in the dark, and the 2 cups steamed in front of her, and she waited. Harrison's car pulled in at 12 minutes. He came through the front door and stood while his eyes adjusted. Then he crossed the floor and sat down across from her, and they looked at each other in the quiet of a closed diner at midnight, and neither spoke immediately. Victoria said, "Your father filed the complaint." Harrison didn't deny it. "It's not true, I know that. You know that." She wrapped both hands around her cup. "But the FBI investigates regardless, and investigations have consequences independent of what they find. Roy could lose his business license. Dorothy could lose her job. I practice law in this state, and a formal investigation of this kind affects my standing, which means I can't continue to represent veterans who need someone in their corner. All of that. Because your father calculated that destroying this is cheaper than what we've already set in motion." Harrison's jaw was set. "I'll tell them it's false. I'll testify to everything. You're his son. Everything you say will be filtered through that. Then what do we do?" Victoria reached into the inside pocket of her jacket and removed a manila envelope folded once and set it on the table between them. She did not open it immediately. "A journalist named Colleen Marsh has been investigating your father's financial conduct for 2 years. Veterans Affairs healthcare funding, federal allocation oversight." He paused. "She found things. She came to me 6 months ago. I've been waiting for a primary source." Harrison looked at the envelope. "What kind of things?" Victoria opened it. She spread the documents across table 9, the same table where she had been sitting on a Thursday morning 4 weeks ago when a young man walked through the front door of a diner with his eyes on his phone and his whole understanding of the world arranged around a lie. The documents were thorough and precise. Bank records, transfer records, internal a correspondence covering 7 fiscal years, funds designated for medical care, for prescriptions, for rehabilitation, for the machinery of honoring the commitments made to men and women who had offered their bodies in service and returned with the physical consequences of having done so. Those funds had moved through arrangements that required expertise to establish and expertise to trace into accounts that were not their designated destinations. $4.2 million. 7 years. Then Victoria placed one specific page directly in front of Harrison. A list. Veterans whose benefit claims had been denied or reduced during the relevant period. 47 names, each with a date and a denial code and a dollar amount. Victoria placed her finger on one name near the middle of the second column. Harrison leaned forward and read it. He read it again. Frank Calloway. Claim denial. March 2009. Treatment authorization $87,000. Status denied, code 7B. Appeal filed September 2009. Appeal denied December 2009. Patient deceased February 2011. The room held the particular silence of a place where something has just become permanent. Harrison sat with the page in front of him and did not speak and did not move. Victoria waited. Frank Calloway had served as a sergeant in the United States Army. He had come home. He had developed lung cancer in 2010, the aggressive kind that moves fast when it is not treated. An authorization for treatment had been submitted through the VA system in the spring of 2009. It had been denied on cost-effectiveness grounds, a category of denial that existed as a formal mechanism, and that could, in the hands of someone who understood the system's architecture, be made to appear where it served other purposes. Senator Gerald Langford had been running his first re-election campaign in 2009. He had needed money. He had known where to find it and how to access it in a way that looked from most angles like administrative process rather than theft. Frank Calloway had died in February of 2011 because a treatment authorization for $87,000 had been denied, and the money that might have paid for it had instead moved through a series of accounts into the financing of a campaign that had successfully returned Gerald Langford to his Senate seat. Harrison Langford had grown up on that money, had attended his private school, worn his expensive clothes, driven his car across the diagonal lines of whatever parking lot presented itself on money that had come from the mechanism that killed Frank Calloway. had walked into the Silver Spoon Diner and treated the woman who had loved Frank Calloway and buried him and raised his son's daughter alone on a waitress's salary as though she were something he was entitled to degrade. Victoria said nothing. She let the documents be what they were. After a very long time, Harrison said, "She doesn't know. She thinks it was just a system, just paperwork." "Yes," he said, "I've been working next to her for 4 weeks." Victoria looked at him steadily. He said, "I have been standing next to her for 4 weeks and she has been teaching me things and my father. My father killed her husband." He stopped. Victoria waited. He said very quietly, "What do we do?" Victoria looked at him for a long moment. She looked at the boy who had walked into this diner 5 weeks ago with his whole life organized around a lie about who mattered and who didn't, who was sitting across from her, now in the dark with the price of that lie spread across the table between them, and the only question left being what he intended to do about it. She pushed the documents across to him. "That's your call," she said. Her voice was level and certain and contained 30 years of the Brotherhood and 47 years of a promise, and one Tuesday night in a diner where everything that had been heading somewhere finally arrived. "Not mine. Never was." Harrison sat with his hands flat on the papers. Outside, Millbrook was asleep, the streets empty, the town breathing in the slow way of a place that did not yet know what was coming for it. On the page beneath his right hand, a name: Frank Calloway, sergeant, beloved husband, a man Harrison had never met whose death had underwritten every year of Harrison's life. He sat with that for a long time. When he finally looked up, something in his face had changed. Not peace, not relief. Something quieter and heavier than either. The expression of someone who has stopped deliberating and arrived at knowing. He folded the documents carefully with the care you use for something you intend to carry. He put them inside his jacket, against his chest. He drove home through the empty streets of Millbrook. He did not sleep. Part 3. The last honest thing. Harrison arrived at the Silver Spoon Diner at 5:30 in the morning, not 5:45. 5:30 in the absolute dark with the documents folded inside his jacket and their weight pressing against his ribs with each breath on the drive over. He had not slept. He had sat at the desk in his childhood bedroom, surrounded by the artifacts of a life that had begun over the previous 5 weeks to look like evidence of something: trophies and acceptance letters, and the careful architecture of a future his father had built around him. The way you build a structure around a foundation, you need to stay hidden. And he had read the documents 4 more times, and then he had stopped reading them because there was nothing further to learn from them, only things to decide. He let himself in through the back door with the key Roy had given him. In the 3rd week, a small gesture made without ceremony, the way Roy made most gestures, as though their significance was self-evident and did not require annotation. He started the coffee. He moved through the opening routine that Dorothy had shown him in the first days. The sequence now settled into his hands in some real way. Not 31 years, but no longer nothing. He checked the napkin dispensers, filled the salt and pepper shakers, wiped down the counter, set the condiment caddy at table 4 with the ketchup bottle facing the direction that Mrs. Delacroix needed it to face, because Mrs. Delacroix would be in at 9, and her right hand had severe arthritis, and she had not asked for help in 11 years, and he was not going to be the reason she had to start. He was behind the counter when Dorothy's car pulled into the lot. He heard the engine's familiar labor, the particular sound of a vehicle kept running through attention rather than money. The small cough at the end when she cut the ignition. He had learned the vocabulary of her mornings in the weeks he had been here, learned it the way you learn things when you are finally paying attention, when the world has finally become something other than a backdrop to your own interior monologue. She came through the back door and saw the lights on, saw the coffee ready, saw him. Their eyes met across the kitchen, and something passed between them in the look that language would only have made smaller. Dorothy set down her bag, she tied her apron, she poured herself a cup and stood at the counter. "I know about Frank," he said. The words were simple and complete, and there was no available path around them. Dorothy stood very still. Her hands were wrapped around the cup. Outside the kitchen window, the sky was the deep blue that exists for only a few minutes before actual dawn, the color of the world holding its breath. She did not cry. She did not ask how. She looked at him with 62 years of accumulated capacity for absorbing what arrived and continuing. "How long have you known since last night?" She nodded. "What are you going to do?" Harrison held her gaze. "The last honest thing I've ever done in my life." Dorothy looked at him for a long moment. She looked at him with something that lived in the neighborhood of both warmth and forgiveness, without being precisely either the look of a woman who has seen enough of human nature to recognize when something genuine is occurring inside a person regardless of the history that person is carrying. She nodded once, private and small. Then let's get the diner open. Victoria was parked across the street at 6:15. She had been there since 6. She had not called ahead. She sat in her truck with the engine off and the heater running and watched through the window of the Silver Spoon as the lights came on and two people moved through the opening routine of a diner in a small Montana town, and the image of them moving together through the ordinary operations of an early morning had a quality to it that she recognized but would have had difficulty articulating the quality of things that have reached some kind of resolution, not completion, but resolution, not the end of difficulty, but the beginning of clarity. She knew what Harrison had decided. She had known when he did not call, when the silence from that direction had the specific texture of someone past deliberation already inside the consequence, no longer weighing options because the options had resolved into a single direction. She sat in the truck and she thought about her mother, Margaret Webb, 36 years old, working double shifts because the margin was too narrow for anything less. Standing in a courtroom in 1978, while a 22-year-old lawyer with ambitions took apart everything she had said and everything she was with the methodical efficiency of someone who had calculated that the cost of doing this would be paid by someone other than himself. He had been right about that calculation. He had been right for 47 years. Victoria thought about the 47 years between that courtroom and this parking lot. Every Thursday, every cup of coffee, every mile and every case, and every time she had driven into Millbrook and pulled into the Silver Spoon lot and walked to Table 9 because Dorothy Calloway was exactly the kind of patron she had built everything to stand beside. And being here, showing up, here being the presence that said you are not alone, was the work, was the whole of the work, was the thing her mother had needed and had not had and had died without. She started the truck. She had calls to make. The morning of the press conference was cold and overcast in the way of Montana. In the shoulder season, the sky low in uniform. Neither the deep white of winter nor the high blue of summer, but a consistent gray that made the world look honest, stripped of the particular flattery that good light provides. Colleen Marsh had been in Millbrook for 2 days. She was a journalist who had spent 2 years assembling evidence she could not fully publish, without a primary source withstanding someone whose relationship to the material was direct enough that their account could not be repositioned as speculation or agenda. She had come to Harrison at the diner the morning after the meeting at Table 9. She had sat at the counter, ordered coffee, tipped well, and then placed a card in front of him when the diner was quiet. She had said, "I've been looking for someone like you." He had called her that evening. They had met twice in the following days. She had shown him everything she had. He had confirmed what the documents contained and provided the interior of it, the things that only someone who had grown up inside the architecture of Gerald Langford's life could provide. The conversations at the dinner table that had not made sense at the time. The phone calls taken in the study with the door closed. The years when money had appeared in quantities that the stated income could not fully account for. Colleen had spent the day before the press came for funds on the phone with her editor and her legal team. The evidence was solid thoroughly, so the product of 2 years of careful work that had been waiting for exactly this convergence. Millbrook County Courthouse steps, 27 journalists, 3 cameras, a cluster of Millbrook residents who had stopped because an unusual gathering in a town this size is everyone's business. Harrison stood at the microphone. He was wearing clothes he had bought with his own money from the diner, practical and correct. He had combed his hair the way a person combs their hair when they are trying to look like the person they are becoming rather than the person they have been. Behind him in a line stood Victoria Webb and Dean Briggs and Everett Thorne and Shepard Caulfield and the other 6 members of the Iron Brotherhood. Not in front of him, behind him, not to protect, to witness in the oldest and most serious sense of the word. To Harrison's right, slightly back, Dorothy Calloway stood beside Colleen Marsh. She was wearing her good coat. She held a folder of documents in both hands, with the care of someone carrying something that had cost a great deal to assemble. Harrison looked at the cameras. His hands were not entirely steady. He began anyway. "My name is Harrison Langford. My father is Senator Gerald Langford of Montana. 6 weeks ago, I walked into the Silver Spoon Diner on Main Street, and I spit in the face of a 62-year-old woman named Dorothy Calloway because she brought me a breakfast order I found unsatisfactory. The gathered press absorbed this. I did it because I had been raised to believe that people who serve others are less important than the people being served. That my family's money and my father's position exempted me from ordinary human accountability. I was wrong about all of it. He let that sit in the cold air. The Iron Brotherhood did not threaten me. They gave me 60 days to learn what I should have been taught from the beginning. What it means to work. What dignity costs a person to maintain in the face of people who see it as a weakness to exploit rather than a quality to respect. He reached into his jacket, removed the folded documents. I am also here because I have discovered that my father has been stealing from the people he was elected to serve. Over 7 years, Senator Gerald Langford redirected approximately $4.2 million from the Veterans Affairs Healthcare Fund into accounts used to finance his campaigns and his personal assets. The documentation is being distributed to the press now. Colleen Marsh and her assistant moved. Packets of documents began moving through the gathered journalists. One of the veterans whose benefits were denied during this period was Frank Calloway, Dorothy's husband. He was diagnosed with lung cancer in 2010. An authorization for $87,000 in treatment was submitted to the VA in 2009. It was denied. Frank Calloway died in February of 2011. The money that might have treated him went into my father's re-election campaign. I grew up on that money. I wore it and drove it and took it entirely for granted, and then I walked into the diner where Frank Calloway's wife has been working for 31 years, and I treated her as though she were beneath my notice. Harrison looked down at his hands on the microphone stand. He looked up. I am releasing all of this evidence to the press today. I am cooperating fully with a federal investigation. Not the false one my father initiated against the Brotherhood, the real one, the one into him. He stepped back from the microphone. The crowd erupted, questions from multiple directions. Cameras moving, Colleen stepped forward. Her assistant distributed the second and more comprehensive packet. Harrison walked down the courthouse steps. Victoria was at the bottom. She looked at him for a moment. The Brotherhood stood behind her in the cold morning air. You did good, she said. I just destroyed my father. Your father destroyed himself. You stopped protecting him from the consequences. There's a difference. They stood together in the noise. Dorothy appeared beside them. She looked at Harrison with the expression of a woman who has been waiting for a long time for something to be said that could not be unsaid, for something to be made visible that had been invisible for 14 years. Thank you, Harrison said. I'm sorry it took this long. I'm sorry about Frank. I'm sorry for everything. She put her hand briefly on his arm. I know, and I forgive you. That's what you do when someone actually changes. You let them start over. The following 72 hours moved with the velocity of things that have been building for a long time and have finally found their direction. Senator Langford's office issued a statement by noon on the day of the press conference. The allegations were fabricated, the product of a criminal organization that had psychologically manipulated a troubled young man. The statement was professionally worded and cited Harrison's mental state and the circumstances of the 60-day arrangement with the specificity of people who had been preparing this response in advance. By 6 o'clock that evening, 3 independent financial analysts had confirmed on record that the transfer patterns in the documents were consistent with systematic misappropriation. By 10 o'clock, a VA official in Helena had confirmed the existence of an internal audit flagged 18 months earlier and quietly buried. By midnight, 2 of Gerald Langford's senior staff had stopped responding to his press office's communications. The following morning, the documents appeared on the front pages of the state's 2 largest newspapers. By that afternoon, a veteran named Robert Dillard from Butte, one of the 47 names on the list, was being interviewed on camera outside his home. He looked at the reporter and he said, with the quiet dignity of someone who has waited a very long time to be visible, "We knew something was wrong. We knew for years. We just couldn't prove it." 46 other veterans and the families of veterans who were no longer alive to speak for themselves were watching. The video surfaced on the second day. A customer had been in the Silver Spoon that Thursday morning 6 weeks earlier with a phone. Not with any particular purpose. Just someone who had seen something they could not look away from and had done what people do now when that happens. The footage was imperfect, shot from an angle across the diner, the sound occasionally clouded by the ambient noise of the room. But it was clear enough. You could see Dorothy standing with her tray. You could see Harrison at the window table, the contempt in his posture, the escalation, the moment. You could see what he did, and then you could see 10 people stand up from table 9. Victoria had not known the footage existed until it appeared. She watched it on Shepard's phone on a Thursday morning at the new table 9, and she watched herself rise from her chair and cross the floor and sit down across from a boy who had never been told no. And she felt the 47 years of it, the specific weight and specific direction of all the Thursdays and all the miles and all the cases and all the words written on a yellow legal pad and she did not try to say anything about what she felt because some things are not improved by being articulated. 8 million views in 6 hours, 15 million by the following morning. The hashtag organized itself within the first hour and spread with the velocity of something that lands in the center of a feeling, a great many people already possessed without a specific place to put it. Dorothy's phone rang continuously. Roy fielded the news crews that appeared outside the Silver Spoon with the patient competence of a former Marine who has managed more difficult situations in less comfortable environments. The diner was still a working diner. The people of Millbrook still needed their breakfast. The ordinary business of the world did not pause for viral moments, which was one of the better qualities of the ordinary business of the world. The GoFundMe appeared on the third day. Anonymous account, goal stated simply, help Dorothy Calloway, $50,000 on the first day. Victoria sat at table 9 and watched the number on Roy's laptop screen and did not speak. Dorothy sat beside her. She looked at the screen for a long time. This isn't real, she said. It's real. I don't understand why. Victoria looked at her. Because people saw you. She said it the way she said things that mattered directly and without ornamentation. They saw you hold yourself together when everything in that room was working to take you apart, and they wanted to stand with you. That's what this is. People wanting to stand with someone who deserved it. Dorothy looked at the screen again. The number was still climbing. She put her hands over her face. She cried then. The way you cry when something you have been holding for a very long time is finally allowed to put itself down when the muscles that have been braced for years are released, and the release is enormous and private and has nothing to do with weakness and everything to do with what it costs to carry what she had been carrying. Victoria sat beside her. She didn't say anything because the silence was the right thing, and she knew it, and she stayed in it. 200,000 by the end of the week, 1.8 million when the account closed 2 weeks later. Senator Gerald Langford was indicted on 17 counts of federal fraud, embezzlement, and misappropriation of public funds. He resigned from the Senate 4 days after the indictment in a brief statement that contained no apology and acknowledged no wrongdoing. The statement of a man who has spent his entire adult life in the practice of calculating what things cost and was calculating this one to the very last. He entered a guilty plea 6 weeks later, negotiated to 8 counts in exchange for full cooperation with a broader investigation into funding irregularities across 3 states. The sentence was 8 years, eligible for parole in 5. Harrison attended the sentencing. He sat in the gallery among the public, in the place where people sit when they are present as witnesses rather than participants. His mother had not come. She had filed for divorce within 10 days of the indictment and relocated to Connecticut with the efficiency of a woman who had identified her exit point and moved toward it. Harrison did not judge this. He had made his own calculation about what he owed the people around him, and it had led him to a courthouse steps in the cold, and she had made hers, and it had led her north. Both calculations had been honest in their different ways. Gerald Langford was smaller than he had been. Not physically, exactly. The suit was the same quality. The posture was professionally maintained, but the thing that had previously animated all of it, the absolute unquestioned authority of a man who had never been required to face what his choices cost, was gone, and without it, the exterior was just materials. The judge spoke. The sentence was pronounced. Gerald Langford was being led from the courtroom when he turned. His eyes found Harrison in the gallery. They looked at each other across the room, across 47 years of a debt that had finally been called in, across the distance between a 22-year-old lawyer on the make and a woman named Margaret who had needed someone to stand up for her and found only procedures that failed her. Gerald Langford nodded, small, almost imperceptible. Not an apology. Gerald Langford did not know how to make apologies, and it was too late now to learn the kind that would mean anything. But something. The nod of a man who is finally in the wreckage, seeing clearly what he refused to see when seeing it, might have changed anything. Then he was gone through a door into a future that would be very different from the one he had built and maintained for 50 years. Harrison sat in the emptying courtroom. Dorothy appeared from the back row. She had been there through all of it in the way she was present for most things completely and without announcement. She sat beside him. They looked at the empty judge's bench. "What happens now?" he said. For me, she considered it with the seriousness it deserved. "I'm going back to school, finishing my nursing degree. Doc has been helping me with the application process. I want to work at the VA. I want to make sure what happened to Frank doesn't happen to anyone else if there's anything I can do about it." Harrison looked at his hands. "That's what I want to do too, in some form. Social work maybe, something that puts me where I can actually help." Dorothy looked at him steadily in her good coat with the folder she had carried from the diner for this day. "You're not Harrison Langford anymore," she said. "Not the one who walked into my diner and decided I wasn't worth basic decency. You're just pressed now, a kid who's figured out what direction to go. That's a good place to be." "That's a good place to start," he said. She almost smiled. "It really is." Walter Keene came into the Morning Bell once on a Thursday in October. He sat at the counter rather than table 9, which was right, which was his to choose. Harrison brought him coffee without being asked. They did not speak about Tyler directly. They did not need to. Walter looked at his cup for a moment and then looked up at Harrison. "You're different," he said. Harrison said, "I'm trying to be." Walter nodded once. The nod of a man who has decided to believe something despite possessing every reason not to. He left a $5 tip on a $2 cup of coffee. He walked out into the cold morning without looking back. Harrison stood at the counter and held the $5 for a long time before putting it in the register. He thought about Tyler, who had believed people could be better than they showed themselves to be. He thought, "I know. I'm trying." 6 months moved through Millbrook. Dorothy finished her nursing prerequisites in the spring. Victoria drove her to Billings for the community college entrance interview and sat in the parking lot with a thermos of coffee and the particular patience of someone for whom waiting has never meant absence. Dorothy was accepted. She began in September. She visited the Morning Bell on Thursday mornings when her schedule allowed. Not as an employee now, but as someone who belonged to the place in a different way, the way people belong to things they have helped make possible without being the one who made them. Dylan came home in the autumn. He moved back to Sycamore Street, thin and careful, carrying the particular watchfulness of someone who has spent years in an environment that required constant attention and has not yet fully adjusted to the absence of that requirement. Lucy did not immediately trust him, which was appropriate, which was correct, which Dorothy watched with the attention of a woman who understood that trust is not installed, but cultivated and requires the time it requires. She gave them room. She watched from doorways. She did not rush anything. By December, Lucy was teaching her father chess at the kitchen table, patient with his mistakes in the total and unreserved way that children are patient with adults they have decided to accept. Dorothy watched from the kitchen doorway and felt something she did not have an immediate word for, and then recognized something she had not felt in a very long time. Quieter than happiness and more durable. The feeling of a life that has arrived imperfectly and at great cost at a place where tomorrow is something to move toward rather than brace against. Roy sold the Silver Spoon to a developer in the spring as planned and retired to a small place outside town that had a large garage where he could work on engines in the kind of silence he had been earning for 22 years of 6 in the morning kitchen starts. Before the sale was finalized, he spent 3 weeks in the back storage room and emerged with a brass plaque he had commissioned from a metal worker in Billings, a thing he had been planning for longer than he acknowledged. He brought it to the Morning Bell, the new diner 4 blocks east, owned by a woman named Pauline, who had come to Millbrook from elsewhere and had opened the place because that was what she had always wanted, and she had decided at a certain age that wanting a thing out loud was more sensible than the alternative. Pauline had heard about the Silver Spoon, about Table 9 and what had happened there and what had come after. She looked at Roy's plaque and she said yes, for he had finished explaining what he was asking. The plaque was installed above Table 9 in the Morning Bell. It read Margaret's Place, reserved for the Iron Brotherhood, MC Protectors of Dignity. On the first Thursday of June, nearly a year after the morning at the Silver Spoon, Victoria Webb walked into the Morning Bell at 7:15. She came in with the Brotherhood, same formation in the lot, same entry, same movement to Table 9 with the ease of decades. Pauline had the coffee ready. She had been briefed. She understood what Table 9 meant to the people who sat at it, and she treated it with the corresponding seriousness without making a production of doing so. Victoria stopped in front of the plaque. Roy stood beside her, Dorothy beside Roy, the Brotherhood behind them. Harrison at the counter where he worked 3 mornings a week around his community college schedule and his social work coursework in the small apartment he rented on the east side of town on money earned at an hourly rate, which turned out to be enough when it was what you had. Victoria ran her fingers across the raised letters. Margaret, the name she had carried for 47 years. The name that had made everything necessary and then made it real. The name that had been in the room with her in every courtroom and on every ride and at every table, 9 in every diner across this state for 3 decades. Roy's voice was thick in a way that Roy Stanton's voice did not often permit itself to be. Figured it needed to go somewhere that still matters. Somewhere that remembers. Victoria stood with her fingers on the brass letters and felt the 47 years of it. Felt the 14-year-old girl at the kitchen table doing her homework, because her mother had said that was the most important thing, and the way that trust had felt like enough and had not been enough, and the specific quality of the silence she had come home to, and what she had done with that silence over the 5 decades since. She had done this with it, this table, these people, this plaque on this wall. When she turned, her eyes were wet. She did not apologize for that. She had learned over many years that grief worn openly is not weakness but accuracy, that it shows the true scale of what things cost, and that pretending things cost less than they do is a form of dishonesty she had decided long ago to stop practicing. Dean handed her coffee. Shepard was already seated, eyes closed briefly in whatever prayer a retired minister offers and when something has reached its proper end. Doc was watching the door. Harrison came through from behind the counter carrying the coffee tray and stopped when he saw the plaque. He stood in front of it and read it. He stood there for a long time. Then he turned to Victoria. "Tell me about her." Victoria looked at him. She sat down at table 9. She wrapped her hands around her cup. She began. Margaret Webb, 36 years old. She worked doubles whenever they were available and never complained about it, because complaining was a luxury she had accurately assessed that she could not afford. She believed in education the way some people believe in things they can see clearly from very far away, as a destination you keep walking toward even when the distance is discouraging. She had a laugh that was not proportionate to the size of the room she was in. She could make a meal out of almost nothing and make it feel like she had intended exactly that. She stood in a courtroom and told the truth and was not believed, and went home 2 weeks later and was gone. Victoria paused. She would have liked this town, she said. She would have liked Pauline's coffee. She would have liked to see what you've become, the you that you're becoming. I think she would have been glad this happened, even though it was hard, even though it cost what it counted, because it meant that someone finally got up from the table. Harrison sat down across from her. He said, "Thank you for not giving up on me." Victoria looked at him for a long moment. She said, "Your worst moment brought you here. What you did with it after. That's the part that matters." Dorothy sat down beside Victoria. Pauline appeared from behind the counter with the pot and refilled every cup without being asked, because she understood, without having to be told, that this was the kind of morning that required coffee to remain warm. Outside, the first suggestion of snow was coming down. Just the beginning of it, the kind that arrives in small, tentative quantities in early November, testing the air, finding out whether the season is ready for it. It settled on the parking lot where 10 motorcycles stood in their familiar formation, chrome catching what gray light the overcast provided, patient and present. Inside, the morning bell at table 9, under the brass name of a woman who had deserved better from the world and whose daughter had spent 47 years making the world better. In her name, 10 members of the Iron Brotherhood and 2 women who had been changed by the same morning sat together in the warmth of people who have come through something real and are still standing. Harrison poured cream into his coffee. He had started doing this somewhere in the 4th week, one of the 1,000 small things that shift when larger things are shifting, and he had noticed when he noticed it that he was someone who took cream in his coffee, and that this was one of the small facts of a life he was actually building rather than inheriting. He looked at the plaque. He looked at Victoria. He looked at Dorothy, who was watching the snow through the window, with the expression of a woman who has earned the right to watch weather without calculating what it will cost her, who is learning that some things are simply the world being itself and do not require a response other than witnessing. He thought about a chair scraping against linoleum. He thought about the particular sound of a decision being made by someone who had been waiting 47 years to make it. He thought about what it had taken to build a life around a promise made to a woman who was no longer there to receive it, to ride 10 motorcycles to the same diner on the same morning for 20 years, on the chance that the morning would eventually arrive when the promise would be called upon. It had arrived. Victoria raised her cup. No particular ceremony, no announcement. She simply raised it, and the others raised theirs, and the coffee was warm, and the snow outside was making Millbrook quiet in the way that the first snow of the season always makes a small town quiet, softening the edges of everything, covering the ground with something clean. Margaret Webb had been 36 years old when she died. She had worked doubles and believed in education and had a laugh too big for the room, and had stood in a courtroom and told the truth and had not been protected. Her daughter had spent 47 years making sure that nobody would stand alone the way she had stood alone. And on a Thursday morning in a diner in Millbrook, Montana, at a table with a brass plaque on the wall above it, the promise had been kept, completely and at great cost, and with the full weight of every mile behind it. Kept. The snow kept falling, the coffee stayed warm. And outside in the parking lot, 10 motorcycles stood in their formation, ready for the next Thursday and the one after that, and every Thursday that followed, because that was the work, that was the whole of the work, that was what protect those who serve looked like, when it was not a motto, but a life. Victoria drank her coffee. She thought about her mother. She thought, I hope you can see this. I hope you know it was all for you. The morning continued, and nobody at that table was alone.